And thank you all for inviting me to talk today. Before I begin, just because we live in a certain time, this isn't a partisan presentation. There are some areas where we're going to be working with the Biden administration in concert, and there are some areas where we're going to be opposing some of the proposals. So if it sounds political, it's more from a legislative analysis standpoint and not from a partisan standpoint. So that little needed proviso, let me see if I can share a screen here. Oh, it says host has disabled partisan screen share.
Hold on.
Oh, sorry.
Just to be clear, that's Sally's department, not mine.
You should be able to do it now.
All right, let's see. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to focus primarily on tax. Now, the Biden proposals, when you add them all up, basically result in a huge, well, at least substantial tax increase. This is numbers from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, again, a nonpartisan group. So this isn't a Republican or a Democratic analysis. It's a group that is geared toward essentially coming up with spending programs or cost-cutting programs that would lead to a balanced budget, ergo the name. But they're very well respected in DC. So according to their analysis, the Biden proposals in total would raise between 3.35 trillion and a little bit more over the next decade. It would increase taxes basically at the top level a substantial amount. And it would also result in a slower growth than otherwise. And that, even though the numbers that the tax increases are larger, the resulting revenue would be a little bit smaller because of the effect the increased taxes. So we're talking about a huge number of that we have to raise revenue for in order to fund some of the proposals. Before we talk about the actual proposals, it helps to put in context what you're hearing in the news today about budget reconciliation. And if I could just note, if you could put yourself on mute, because the rest of us can hear what's going on.
Please, everybody put yourself on mute.
The reconciliation process, which a lot of you have been reading about, particularly in the context of the COVID relief bill. It's going on now. The Budget Committee just yesterday moved it forward. And essentially what that does is it's kind of a shortcut through the Senate, right? The Senate, most things that have to go through the Senate require 60 votes in order to avoid a filibuster. The reconciliation process allows a bill to be enacted with only a majority. And in this case, that would be the Democrats, since it's a 50-50 Senate and the vice president casts the tie-breaking vote. So the whole purpose of doing this is to expedite a large legislation, make it filibuster-proof. They've already come up with a budget resolution. And then you'll hear references to Byrd Rule, right? This is a reference to Robert Byrd. He was instrumental in crafting this. There are some parliamentary rules for reconciliation that make it difficult to just pass anything you want, right? So it has to specifically affect spending revenues. And it basically limits what you pass for a 10-year period. So that's why you had the Bush tax cuts expiring after 10 years, because it was done through budget reconciliation. And interestingly, it can only be used a number of times. So if you're looking at this COVID bill and thinking, well, they're going to use, the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress are going to use it on COVID, they can't use it again. Well, it's for every fiscal year. So what we're looking at is COVID for this fiscal year, and then a tax bill or an infrastructure bill, or any other, a possible major legislation that President Biden wants to push through, they can then do an FY 2022 reconciliation bill. The thing with reconciliation in this context, as the Senate stands today, you have 50 Democrats. Anything that is controversial or that pulls one Democrat off, basically it defeats the whole purpose of reconciliation, because it becomes very difficult to get it through. And so you're seeing that now with Joe Manchin and his disagreement with raising the minimum wage. Minimum wage also might be objectionable on parliamentary matters or reasons. But what I'm trying to convey here is that when you have such a tight margin, it becomes really difficult to keep all your members together. All right. So I wanted to go through that rather lengthy process just so you'll keep in mind as we go forward on some of these proposals that they're not slam dunks, right? They're going to be opportunities for us to really influence the process. So let's talk about the Biden proposals on the tax front that are of most concern to commercial real estate. He has proposed to increase capital gains rate to ordinary income rate for higher income taxpayers. He would eliminate like-kind exchange.
Yeah. I'm listening to a Zoom.
He would.
Excuse me, somebody, could you possibly turn off your audio, please?
It's Mitch Weber.
So like-kind exchanges are on the are a target. He would eliminate a capital gains tax treatment for carried interests or promotes. And then he would repeal the 20% deduction for partnerships, LLCs, and other pass-through entities. There have been some comments on depreciation and cost recovery. Also, he would eliminate the stepped-up basis for estates, which is not necessarily just limited to commercial real estate, but something that is of major concern to a lot of our members. And then, of course, the top individual tax rates would go up. Corporate tax rates would also go up. And then there have been some discussions, hints on opportunity zones, which may end up limiting some of the real estate investments that we have that are available now in those areas. So those are essentially a long list of things that have been on people's radar screen in terms of commercial real estate. For the capital gains issue, he would raise top capital gains rate to, again, 39.6 for those people with at higher income level. And while that sounds, populist in nature, we understand that what we're talking about is the investor class, right? So when you double capital gains, that has a major impact on what happens in commercial real estate. Now, it's important for NAIOP members to understand where we're coming from on the capital gains debate. 20% capital gains isn't written into anyone's religious text. It's not in the Bible. It's not something that is essentially as important as keeping a differential between capital gains and ordinary income. That really is what we're essentially trying to protect. Now, in the past, Congress has supported this because they see that it leads to productive investment in real estate. And we know that a lower capital gains rate is needed in order to basically account for the inherent risk in a long-term capital investment, which is essentially what real estate is. Whatever Biden proposes is going to have to go through the Senate Finance Committee, and that's an interesting hurdle in itself. The new chairman is Ron Wyden from Oregon, and he has his own ideas on capital gains. He has proposed or has an idea. He hasn't really proposed legislative language, but he has some proposals of essentially a wealth tax. And he would, if you own stock, for example, and there's appreciation during the year in that stock, you would be taxed on that appreciation annually. For assets that are not as tradable as stocks, in other words, real estate, There's a complex method where he would look at depreciation that you've taken over the year and figure out essentially a tax hit for a real estate. So this whole notion of a mark-to-market capital gains type of paradigm is something that he wants to push forward. Not a lot of support, as far as I can gauge, for that, particularly because it's complicated. But he has already mentioned that he wants to go forward with it. So we'll see how Senator Wyden and President Biden work on this as we go forward. So the politics of capital gains, right? So a lot of attention has been given to the growing inequality in the US, growing income inequality, and the pandemic has made that worse. So there's a lot of political pressure coming from the Democratic progressive wing of the party to increase taxes on the wealthy. Now, if you look at the last election, one thing that happened was at the House, which Democrats in the House expected to pick up seats. In fact, Republicans picked up seats, even though Trump lost the presidency. And that has worried a lot of centrist Democrats. They've alluded to the social justice issues that we saw over the summer as having hurt them. But a lot of them are also looking at the next election, midterm election, which traditionally the party in power in the White House loses seats in the House. So centrist Democrats are not in a hurry to increase taxes and have that be used against them. We know Senate Republicans will oppose tax increases on capital gains, right? That's part of their talking point, but also underlying their economic philosophy. And so my view is, I don't know that President Biden gets a capital gains tax increase to the level that he wants it, because he's going to have pushback from his own party. But I do see it as kind of the opening salvo in this whole capital gains tax debate. And again, our goal here is, we'd like to keep it at 20, but if we can keep a meaningful differential, I think that's a win going forward. Another thing that President Biden, candidate Biden spoke about was eliminating 1031 exchanges. Now, this is tricky because he didn't say those words, but what he did say was that he would roll back unproductive and unequal tax breaks for real estate investors. That's the exact quote that you see on the page. And later, when media outlets questioned the staff, they basically cited 1031s. So we know that that's what we're looking at as a pay for some of these proposals that enjoy a lot of popularity. Increasing funds for education and caregiving is always something that has a lot of support, but of course, then you offset it with tax hikes on commercial real estate. For 1031s, there are a lot of policy arguments that we use on the Hill. We try to explain, number one, what they are. Most people in America who aren't involved in real estate don't know what a 1031 like-kind exchange is, right? And so it sounds, particularly if the language used in politics alludes to it as a loophole for rich real estate developers, then you know that right there the premise is against us in terms of arguing for it. But so our first goal is to essentially educate people on 1031s. And part of the appeal of a 1031 is that really it allows commercial real estate investment to remain in commercial real estate. When we have a depreciation over a course of years, what that leads to is it is a disincentive to sell the property because you have this huge tax hit. So you have this lock-in effect. And what a like-kind exchange allows is for more flexibility among real estate investors. And that allows real estate investors to shift geographic locations. It allows a lot more movement, but it keeps investment in commercial real estate. And another thing that we need to point out to people is that like-kind exchanges have already been restricted. They were restricted by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the tax reform bill that was passed by Trump. In the old days, there were a lot of like-kind exchanges that involve properties other than real estate. You know, you had art, you had fleets of rental cars, for example, and now it's primarily restricted to real estate properties. When you're dealing with an issue like 1031s, you're going to be dealing with people in Congress, staffers primarily, and the Joint Committee on Tax. And so what we found working with our real estate partners, the realtors, the Real Estate Roundtable, the home builders, we've funded, and this is you know, a different sort of study in the sense that we funded a study on the impact of 1031s, but it was a hands-off study. In other words, it was done by academic professionals, published in academic journals, which you know, have some standards. So this cannot be easily dismissed as just a study funded by an industry group. This actually has some weight on the Hill. We did this in 2017 when we went to the Hill to defend 1031s against tax reform. At that time, and again, this is not a partisan issue, there are people on the Republican side and the Democratic side who think there's too much investment going to real estate anyway. So getting rid of 1031s is not something that they worry about. So we had to make the argument on both sides of the aisle. This provided us with a lot of economic data that was useful in that regard. And we've updated that study for 2020 in anticipation of a fight. Now, I just mentioned that both sides of the aisle are areas where we have to convince people. And the committee tax staff are especially influenced by, good, reliable economic data. And that's where our 1031 is really, 1031 study is really useful. Now, what has this study showed is that about 20% of transactions in real estate involve a like-kind exchange. A lot of people don't know that about a quarter of like-kind exchanges have some connection to properties in California. So our effort is to educate California members on that regard. If you got rid of like-kind exchanges, rents would have to rise in order to make some of these transactions pencil out. And then what we try to, people have this idea that 1031 essentially allow folks to avoid taxation forever. Now, that may be the case in some cases, but in most cases, a 1031 exchange is followed by a sale, not shortly thereafter, but sometime thereafter, which results in a higher tax revenue being brought into the government. So the idea that this is just a tax loss or a revenue loss to the government doesn't really play out if you extend it and look beyond just that initial transaction. Now, the other, in addition to 1031s, which is again characterized as a loophole, one of the things that we've been fighting for a long time is a tax increase on carried interests or promotes. If you've been listening to NAIOP over the years, you know that this fight has been going on for a long time now. And the issue, of course, is that one, carried interests have been traditionally treated as capital gains, but it's very difficult to actually characterize it as a capital gain. In other words, a capital gain sometimes it's kind of a gray area. So if you have a secretary in Silicon Valley that's received stock in lieu of salary, right? That person could become a millionaire, and that is a carried interest. Should that be treated as ordinary income or not? Right now, it's treated as capital gains. The same with real estate. If you are a general partner and you pull together investors, and all of a sudden, in the days when you actually could build a shopping center and make that profitable, if you were to develop that 5 years later, you would have been given essentially a piece of the action. All right, and once that project was sold, the profit that the general partner got, even though that general partner didn't put in any capital himself or herself, would be treated as a capital gain. And the whole idea there was that real estate was more like a permanent capital gain asset than not. The problem, of course, the optics problem was Wall Street hedge fund managers were using this in order to avoid higher taxation, in order to avoid ordinary income tax rates. And that became a popular goal among the the movement after the 2008 recession, the Great Recession, the MoveOn.org and the Occupy Wall Street movement started talking about carried interest, and it was taken up as kind of almost a defining issue for the progressive left. We fought this fight in the tax reform bill, and what our fallback position was, all right, if you were going to get rid of carried interest, at least do it in a way that protects long-term investments that are really more like capital gains than not. And so they included a 3-year holding period now for carried interest to be counted as capital gains. And that protected a lot of real estate investments, right? Because they're really between 3 to 5 years was the number that we were given by our members as something that they could live with. And so right now, a carried interest has to have a 3-year holding period, which makes it more like a capital gain. Biden would essentially tax carried interest as ordinary income. And Democratic lawmakers have already introduced a bill. Bill Pascrell has done so. Wyden, for his part, would treat carried interest as a loan and tax it accordingly. The politics of the carried interest debate make it a very hard fight for real estate, essentially. It is something that sounds like a giveaway to the rich. It is tough in this environment to protect it, and particularly when there's such pressure to raise revenue. Now, the ironic thing is that this won't raise that much revenue because the original problem has already been taken care of by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the 3-year holding period. But again, it counts more as a political scalp at this point. So this is going to be a tough one to fight. Another one that is of real concern to commercial real estate is that President Biden would repeal the 20% deduction that was created in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act for pass-through businesses. And there are a lot of restrictions on what is a qualified business income that is eligible for this 20% deduction. But having said that, the original purpose of this 20% deduction was essentially to make up for the perceived disincentive that would be created by the lowering tax rates, right? So the corporate tax rates from 35 to 21%. When you do that, all of a sudden the pass-throughs are disadvantaged, right? Because corporations as an entity are a lot more appealing. So that particularly Ron Johnson from Wisconsin and other Republicans basically took up the mantra that we have to protect the pass-throughs as well. So they created this 20% deduction, which when you work out the math, effectively ends up being like a 29.6% effective tax rate on pass-throughs. So corporate tax rates went down to 21. The pass-through rate went down to 29.6. The Biden proposal would raise tax rates on pass-throughs up to 39.6. Again, he would increase the top rate from 37 to 39.6. That's what he was proposing for the pass-through taxation rate for those with incomes over $400,000. Now, from our perspective, half of business income is earned by pass-throughs, and real estate is predominantly held in pass-through form. So this is something that could impact a lot of our members. And the idea of getting rid of this pass-through deduction is again, based on how it was originally promoted, it's kind of connected to what they do on corporate tax rates. So I think there's kind of a tandem analysis here in terms of how much you raise tax increases in any one type of corporate or a pass-through entity. Another area that, and less specific in terms of commercial real estate, but still something of concern to me, and that is the whole issue of cost recovery. Now, the Biden campaign proposed increasing the depreciation period on residential multifamily projects from 27.5 to 39 years. Depreciation is one of those things that, again, in the popular mentality, is something that real estate developers kind of play with a tax code, and they end up getting a break. And we understand there's an economic reality, obviously, but it's, again, politically difficult. The other thing that makes depreciation difficult is that it gives anyone who wants to pass a bill in Congress a number, an offset, that they can then use to offset whatever spending they're proposing. And it's one of these things that it's hard to describe how that impacts any individual, right? So you have Biden already proposing moving up depreciation in the residential sphere. We just had a long fight to make qualified improvement property or leasehold improvements depreciable over 15 years. Every year we would go to Congress and argue that 39 years for leasehold improvements was ridiculous, right? Leasehold improvements do not last 4 decades. And so we would get 15 years, but Congress made us come to them again as supplicants year after year to get this. We finally got this made permanent in the CARES Act, ironically. I worry that it could be a target. And so part of our fight is going to make sure that we could maintain what was done in the CARES Act on leasehold depreciation. Now, there are other areas, other issues in the tax area that are of particular concern to a lot of NAIOP members and people in commercial real estate. One is in the whole estate tax area. The Biden has proposed to get rid of what's known as stepped up basis. And that, as most on this call would know, you have a property. If you keep a property for 10 or 20 years, when that property goes to that person's heirs, the basis of the property is basically the fair market value at the time that it's passed on. And so when that property is sold, the capital gains hit is much less than the alternative, which is a carryover basis. So if you buy under carryover, if you buy a property 10 or 20 years in the past, and it's enjoyed huge appreciation, now under the Biden plan, when it gets passed on to the heirs, all of that appreciation is going to get taxed. So it's a big tax hit. Now you could argue from a pure tax policy perspective, you could argue whether that's equitable or not, but from a human perspective, you've had people basically planning their estates for a long time, and now they're going to take huge hits. And so there's in tax policy, there's something called path dependency that you always look at, and a lot of folks have been on a path that are now they're going to have the rug pulled out from under them. So there's an argument on both sides of this issue. Another area of concern is the whole notion of opportunity zones. It's something that enjoyed a lot of support, both bipartisan and basically across the board economically. It was a proposal that was pushed by conservative senators. So this isn't a liberal or Republican, liberal Democrat or conservative Republican approach. It's an approach that is designed to help underserved communities. The issue that has arisen is that, again, more in this populist prism that we see everything under, there were articles primarily by the New York Times and LA Times about, Kushner family, members benefiting from developments that they undertook in opportunity zones. And so it became this, again, connected to Trump and real estate developers benefiting. And so there's been some talk about restricting real estate investments or restricting the applicability of opportunity zones to real estate investments. We have to keep an eye on that because, again, that's not really a policy argument. It's more just a pure political, populist approach at this time. And then, of course, corporate tax rate increases. We will keep an eye on that. Obviously, some of our members will be hit, but the corporate tax rate increase, the rate was reduced from 35 to 21. There's a lot of, in my view, a lot of opportunities to increase corporate tax rates and get that done, because even at 28%, it's still lower than what it was. So again, that's something that I think the Biden administration has leverage on. Now, I've talked a lot about the things that concern us, and this webinar has been primarily based on tax proposals, but there are a lot of areas that we can work with the Biden administration. I didn't want to be remiss in just positioning us as totally against the Biden administration. One of these is infrastructure, and it's a bipartisan area, everyone knows that, but it's also a bipartisan approach not to pay for infrastructure, and that's been the problem in the past, right? Nobody wants to pay for this. The House Transportation Committee Chairman Peter DeFazio, we have a very good relationship with him. He's been pushing to increase gas taxes. I think we all know that that is not a long-term answer, particularly if we're moving toward electric cars. And so they're struggling to find a different way of funding for infrastructure. One of the things that, one of the issues that we look at in this space is Section 118 of the tax code. And this is something that a lot of people don't know about, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the tax reform bill that was passed under Trump, essentially got rid of Section 118, which provided that if a developer or an entity received help from a locality, a government, that would not be taxable. Now it is, and this affects some major redevelopment projects. You know, we have one member in Pittsburgh who gets really hit by this because all of a sudden he has a chunk of money that was not taxable before that is now. And this was the origin of this, again, not partisan. This was actually more Republicans pushing for this, was this the unseemly nature that a lot of people thought was that arose when all of these different communities were striving to get Amazon to move into their cities, right? They were basically falling over themselves, giving these tax breaks and all this sort of stuff to Amazon. And that was basically caused a reaction at the federal level. The other thing that we're talking about, and we have been talking about for a while, is a repeal of the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. You know, a foreign individual can invest in stock and not pay a capital gains tax, but the same doesn't hold true for real estate. So FIRPTA essentially discriminates against real estate investment in the United States. And so we're trying to get rid of that. That's been a long-term fight. It's not anything new, but again, in the context of infrastructure, I was at several meetings with Brookfield and on the Hill, and the argument that was made there was that they would invest a lot more in infrastructure. And again, I should have said this: infrastructure under FIRPTA counts as real estate, and so that is so the fact that there's a discrimination against foreign investment in real estate ends up being a discrimination in foreign investment in infrastructure projects as well. We want to get rid of that. And then just as a general talking point, we want to increase the use of public-private partnerships more as a funding flexibility mechanism than anything else. Democrats don't like the idea of public-private partnerships, so that's an uphill fight. But again, when you're looking at ways of getting money for these things, which everyone wants to do, I think there's an argument to be made that we want to encourage more private sector funding to these projects. And then the other area, and this might surprise a lot of NAP members, but an area that I think we can really work with President Biden on is the whole area of energy efficiency. The climate agenda has been going on for some while. It's very, the protracted debate from both sides on this thing gets ugly at times. But in the commercial real estate space, let's face it, a lot of our members are already doing this. There are a lot of measures in the sustainability area where our members want to be at the leading edge of doing this sort of thing. And so we want to be on that side of the argument. And the issue here is, how do you do that? In the past, there have been some very clumsy attempts by the Senate to just impose these arbitrary mandates, and we fought against those. But we have also positioned ourselves to be kind of a moderate voice on this, as opposed to some other real estate groups. And so, for example, we've worked with the Senate on bipartisan legislation to update building codes, having language that requires that these codes have a reasonable payback and that they be technologically and economically feasible, things that seem reasonable to us. And sometimes it's difficult to maintain legislation. We got that, so we're in a good position on that. We're also supporting an idea, it's been proposed, it's been pushed very effectively, primarily by our friends and the Real Estate Roundtable and others, on pushing for a tax incentive that would help commercial real estate owners update or upgrade their buildings. And so we've proposed an accelerated depreciation for investments in energy efficient equipment. So instead of 15 years, it'll be 10 years. That may not sound like a lot, but in fact, there are studies that show that it would actually be a big deal once it gets laid out. So the Biden administration has proposed that all buildings be net zero by 2030. They want to retrofit 4 million buildings. They have a lot of talk in this area, and I think there is this is an area where NAIOP can really work with the Biden administration going forward. And with that, I think I'll stop, turn it over to Eric. I know that's a lot of material out there, a lot on the tax side, but right now we're looking at a tax bill that is probably going to hit us toward the end of the year. Don't know whether the Biden administration might want to push an infrastructure bill before. So we're prepared for the advocacy challenges. But the timing is, again, a little bit up in the air at this point. And with that, Eric, I'll just turn it back to you.
Excellent. Achilles, thank you for a very comprehensive and informative presentation. I see a number of questions coming in. Again, please use the chat function in order to register any question you might have. I'll exercise the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question, Achilles, and that is, of all of this potpourri of different possibilities, what passage of what specific tax act or combination thereof concerns you the most?
I think you came in a little bit off there, Eric, but I think the question was which one of these is probably the one that might actually move faster. I think my concern is the carried interest one, frankly, simply because of the politics of the issue. Also, that's a type of thing that can be inserted into a bill at the last minute. So, for example, this COVID bill that just came out of the Budget Committee now goes to the Rules Committee. Well, the Rules Committee they need to make sure that it complies with the reconciliation rules. And right now, the House version, I think, is 30 billion over. And so they might insert an offset, and that could be a carried interest hit. And all of a sudden, we don't have time to advocate. So, I think that one that's been around for a while is one that concerns me.
Great. Would the elimination of like-kind exchanges be targeted to any specific type of investors, and specifically would it include REITs?
It hasn't been specified. Remember, it wasn't even language on like-kind exchanges per se. It was basically a phrase talking about real estate loopholes, right? And then the staff illuminated the media when they were pressed on, like, what are you talking about? Which loopholes? They said, we're looking at like-kind exchanges. So we don't know what the exact proposal would look like. And that's, I think, where we come into it. I mean, we'd have to work to make sure that there's a minimal damage. But again, I don't know how, it was already limited to real estate, in Tax Reform Act. So I don't know where they go that doesn't include, hurting our members, frankly.
Right. Next question is change to the interest expense limitations contemplated by the Biden administration.
I need to see what they put out. Part of the challenge that we as lobbyists are dealing with is that, and you know, the Trump White House had a hand in this. Generally, when you have an administration, they develop their budget, they send it to Congress, and then they provide, you know, the Green Book and Treasury guidance as to what they're going to do. That process is usually delayed after a new president takes over, simply because of the fact that it's a new president. So, you know, usually we have a budget early February. You know, this time, because of the whole fight during the transition, the Biden administration is even farther behind the curve. And so we don't have language that allows me to answer that question, you know, with any specificity. I think we're going to see that. But again, I wish I had a better answer in terms of a substantive, but I just don't have the materials yet. Next year, Biden the Biden staff has indicated that they will, you know, for want of a better word, return to regular order. In other words, the Trump administration basically stopped doing it. And so I think everyone's looking forward to actually having, you know, substantive things that we can discuss as opposed to just rhetoric.
All right, this next question is a bit of a cousin of the last one, but I'll modify it. And it is, do you expect the Biden tax changes to be effective as of 1/1/21? Clearly, we can't answer that given the paucity of information that we have, but do you expect a grand rollout at once, or given the political landscape, do you expect this to be incremental over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. And, you know, I think right now the focus has been on this COVID bill. As you can see, on the Democratic side, they're trying to get as much as they can in this bill. Some of that is going to have to fall, I think. You know, Chuck Schumer getting millions of dollars for a bridge in upstate New York doesn't really have anything to do with COVID relief, right? That belongs more of an infrastructure bill, but be that as it may, they're trying to get as much in this. So moving forward, do we have a Biden bill that is an infrastructure bill that also includes tax provisions as offsets, or do we have a comprehensive tax bill that proceeds under reconciliation? I think we are yet to see the strategy for the next phase. Right now, we're operating under the assumption that September, you know, fourth quarter is going to be an area where they try to get something done. And if they get something done on the tax side this year, I would think that they would try to make some of this retroactive to 1/1/21.
All right. The last question is, Sally, how do people get copies of Achilles' deck? Everybody's very enamored of that data.
With Achilles' permission, I will send out the deck and the link to the recording, if that's okay with you, Achilles.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, great. Yep, that'll go out later today.
Fantastic. Well, there's no other questions in the chat room. Achilles, that was outstanding. I want to thank you on behalf of our chapter and all the attendees today. Please keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And, you know, same goes for you guys. Sally does a fantastic job. You know, you have members that are very influential. And as this debate moves forward, you know, we're going to need you to really weigh in and provide, you know, your ideas and you know, just your thoughts on how some of these things affect you. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Achilles, and thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks.